Our dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for letting us come together on this Sunday evening as we look at Jewish writings and how we can utilize them in your work so we can better understand the audience to which we're reaching, Lord, and how do we understand the culture that is involved with it. And Lord, how do we gain an understanding to reach all of your people? And I thank you for your help this evening. In the name of your son, Yeshua, amen. So tonight, we are going to take a big jump in time from the last one to this one. We're going to kind of zigzag a little bit, but we're going to go from the Shtetl to the Holocaust. When we think of modern Judaism, there have been several things that have impacted Christianity's impact and effectiveness with Judaism. One, of course, was the Crusades and the Dark Ages. And the next one was the pogroms and the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. Both of those definitely impacted how Jewish people look at Christianity. When we have books of this time frame, when we look at material that's produced during this time frame, or that is about this time frame, it allows us to understand how and why the perspectives are built, and how and why the perceptions are understood. And we're gonna look at a series of books, and we're gonna talk a little bit about specific ones. One of the books, and I use this book because Natan Meir is the head of Jewish studies for Portland State. He is the head of the department. He did a book called Stepchildren of the Shtetl. He wrote this book. This is the book he was working on when I was staying at Neve Sholem for him when he took his sabbatical. And this is what he went specifically to Russia, Ukraine, Poland, all the areas where the shtetls were, what used to be called the Pale of Settlement, part of what was called I don't remember the country. It's no longer a country anymore. That's why it's part of Lithuania. It is part of what was Germany. It was part of what was Prussia. And that environment, for most people, they think of most Americans, particularly, they think of modern play and movie, Fiddler on the Roof, but that portrayal really is glamorized, and really we're going to talk about that specific book that it was based on. But when this book,
David,
yes,
what is the shtetl? I'm not familiar with that.
Shtetl is simply a village composed of mostly Jewish only people that were scattered across Eastern Europe. It is the term used when you talk about one of those villages prior to modern times, right? But by modern, I'm talking about 20th century. Prior to in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, they were called shtetls, those villages of Eastern Europe. It's still simply the name they use for that village. They are composed almost 100% of Jews. So, for example, when I was tracing my ancestral roots, while I knew my great-grandparents' picture was on the wall in the synagogue in Spokane, I ran into a wall in Minnesota. And because my grandfather was there, and I have his second immigration paper, you actually have to get a first immigration paper and a second immigration paper back in the 1800s. And the first one tells where you came from. The second one simply it tells you that you're a citizen of the US. Well, that one was missing, and I still haven't tracked it down to this day. But what you can do because of census records, it listed where he came from. And so I was able to track down that area he came from in the Pale of Settlement where only Jews were allowed to live. So I knew without a shadow of doubt at that point that the family was Jewish, even though their names were Jewish, both on the my great grandfather and my great grandmother, both Jewish names, both came from the same area. But when you pin it down, the odds of them not being Jewish are like 0.001, right? And I'm still researching that because I'm not one of those people that take family's word for it. I found family, unfortunately, to be very unreliable, um, and especially a Jewish ancestry because they did not want people to know, right? Because of repercussions. My great grandparents became Seventh-day Adventists in the 1912 camp meeting. Back in those days, in 1900s, that camp meetings were evangelism services. They weren't gatherings of Adventists. There were Adventists there, but they were outreach and evangelism. And my grandparents, living in Spokane, went to Spokane. I actually have pictures of the camp meeting because my grandmother had pictures. And they were baptized there. But as a result, they immediately ended up moving out of Spokane to Wenatchee because they were cut off from the Jewish community. And so they did a fresh start in Wenatchee, and that my family is in the Wenatchee Valley area. Natchee's that whole area there on that side of the family, who the Adventist ones, I should say. So that's why we have them all the way in Leavenworth and et cetera, et cetera. But when we look at a shtetl, sometimes most shtetls were extremely poor. If you remember from Fiddler on the Roof, he's selling milk, he's walking, he doesn't have the money for a horse, right? It talks about that. The memoir, this book, The Stepchildren of the Shtetl, and we're not going to go into great detail. I just wanted to bring it. It's an academic book for one. When you get a paper written by a college professor as part of their professorship, they typically they are not easy reading because they have to prove their dissertation. The memoirs of a Jewish life in the East European shtetl often recall the hektish, the poor townhouse and its residents, beggars, madmen, mad women, disabled people, poor orphans. Children of the shtetl tells the story of these marginalized figures from the dawn of modernity to the eve of the Holocaust. Combining archival research with analysis of literary, cultural, and religious texts, Natan Meir recovers the lived experience of Jewish society's outcasts and reveals the central role they came to play in the drama of modernization. Those on the margins were often made to bear the burden of the nation as a whole, whether as scapegoats in a moment of crisis or as symbols of degeneration, ripe for transformation by reformers, philanthropists, and nationalists. Shining a light into the darkest corners of Jewish society in Eastern Europe, often from the squalid poorhouse of the shtetl to the slums and insane asylums of Warsaw and Odessa, from the conscription of poor orphans during the reign of King Nicholas I to the Gloria wedding, a magical ritual in which an epidemic was halted by marrying outcasts to each other in the town cemetery. Stepchildren of the shtetl reconsiders the place of the lowest members in an already stigmatized minority. So that was his thesis statement. He really delved deep into the impact of what it meant to be a Jew in a very, very poor area. The second book we're going to look at is Tevye the Dairyman by Sholem Aleichem. Sholem Aleichem, as you will learn, is a pen name. Tevye the Dairyman is a fictional narrator and a protagonist in a series of short stories by Sholem Aleichem. Tevye is a pious Jewish dairyman living in the Russian Empire the patriarch of a family, including several troublesome sister daughters. The village of Boybarak, where the stories is set, is based on the town of Boyarika. I may be pronouncing that right. My Russian is terrible. Ukraine, then part of the Russian Empire. Boybarak is a suburb of Yuhobets, which is based on Kiev, where most of Tevye's customers live. So if we think about the fact he's in the Tevye, he's in the area of Kiev in Ukraine, and this is where it's based. It's one of the areas where there's a high number of shtetls. As Tevye tells Aleichem the tales of his family, 6 of his 7 daughters, Velka, Hava, Hodel, Prince, Tabel, and Zidel, are named, and these 5 play leading roles in Tevye's stories. The stories tell of his business dealings and romantic dealings and marriages of several of his daughters, and the expulsions of the Jews from their village in Russian government. This book has one that most Americans know. They don't know of it being Tevye the Dairyman. They know of it being Fiddler on the Roof. And we're going to talk about why that is, and what it means if you read the book itself. Another book, which is very widely talked about, The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. For those who have not read this, which I don't know if anybody in this group has not read it, The Diary of a Young Girl, often referred to as the Diary of Anne Frank, is a book of the writings from a Dutch language diary kept by Anne Frank while she was in hiding for 2 years with her family during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. The family was apprehended in 1944, and Anne Frank died of typhus in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in 1945. Anne's diaries were retrieved by Meir Guess and Bep Voskogel. Mep gave them to Anne's father, Otto Frank, the family's only survivor, just after the Second World War was over. What most people do not realize, there's 2 versions of the diary written by Anne Frank. She wrote the first version in a designated diary and 2 notebooks, version A, but rewrote it in version B in 1944 after hearing the radio that wartime diaries were to be collected to document the war period. Version B was written on loose paper, and it is not identical to version A, as other parts were added and other parts omitted. And what most people don't, and we're not going to go into this one because it is widely read, when you read the actual diary, version A, it is very much more in the format of a young lady. When you read the version that 99% of the world has read, it, to be honestly, has been sanitized. Now, we read original source material at the university. So, for example, in version A, it talks about her experiencing her first menstrual cycles. It talks to her about her touching her friend's breasts. All of that has been sanitized out. They cleaned up all the stuff that a young lady of a very young age would say or think in their diary, because it's a personal thing. Her version B, she rewrote it because she wanted to become a writer. And so she wrote it in such a way that it would be able to be utilized by newspapers, or perhaps she was hoping to have it made in a book. And that's what the version B is, typically what you see when you see the printed version. However, if you look at the original one, it's written in Dutch. So it's considerably different. It's not as concise. It doesn't follow a stream. It follows like a young girl. Think about any young girl writing a diary. And that's what it is. A much more impactful one. If you want to read a diary about the impact of the camps and the impacts of the ghettos, the Diary of David Sierakowiak. So after the liberation of the Lodz ghetto, his notebooks were found stacked on a cook stove, ready to be burned for heat. Young, young David was one of the more than 60,000 Jews who perished in that notorious urban slave camp, a man-made hell, which was the longest surviving concentration of Jews in Nazi Europe. The diary comprises of a remarkable legacy left to humanity by its teenage author. It is also one of the most fastidiously detailed accounts ever rendered of modern life in human bondage. The luxury of life was never returned to David. He died in the camp, but a new awareness of its richness can be our reward for reading the diary of this brilliant and brutally deprived young human being. It is this is one of the books that we read for the Holocaust class that I took. Very impactful. As I said, it's 5 different notebooks that they found stacked, ready to burn to provide heat when the ghetto was freed. It is very heartrending. It talks about the fact they were given a piece of toast a day. It talks about the fact of going without food for days and days and days. And it really is one of those that you will read it and you wonder how humanity could stoop so low. The next one we're going to look at is Night. Now, those who don't know who Elie Wiesel is, he is probably one of the most famous Holocaust survivor writers. He wrote Night, Dawn, and Day. Night is a 1960 memoir by Elie Wiesel based on the Holocaust experiences with his father in Nazi Germany, German concentration camp of Auschwitz and Buchenwald in 1944 and 1945, toward the end of the Second World War in Europe. In just over 100 pages of sparse and fragmented narrative, Wiesel writes about his loss of faith and increasing disgust of humanity, recounting his experiences from Nazi-established ghettos in his hometown of Romania to his migration through multiple concentration camps. The typical parent-child relationship is inverted as his father dwindled in the camps to a helpless state while Wiesel himself became his teenage caregiver. His father died in January 1945, taken to the crematory after deteriorating from dysentery and a beating, while Wiesel lay silently on the bunk above him in fear of being beaten too. The memoir ends shortly after the United States Army liberated Buchenwald in April 1945. This book, not only is it a moving book about a person losing their faith in God completely, it has also had meaning to me because my uncle Richard was in the 6th Army that liberated Buchenwald. And even though obviously he probably didn't know him, because the pictures my uncle brought back were terrible to say the least. Some of the worst pictures that I have in my collection of what happened to these poor individuals. And Buchenwald wasn't only Jews; it had Jehovah's Witnesses, it had other people that were anybody that fought against Germany was thrown there. It was a mixed group. It wasn't just Jewish. Yes.
I read a book about Buchenwald, and Buchenwald was a place where I don't know about the rest of the concentration camps, but the Jews were very active there. They were very, very socialistic. They were constantly trying to figure out how to get the best of the Nazis. I mean, it was amazing to me how much chutzpah they had.
Yeah, it was a labor camp, not an elimination camp. It wasn't part of the Auschwitz triangle. And they really did try to sabotage many of the works that they did. When they went out behind the fence and they did work, they tried to sabotage the fence.
Yeah, yeah. And what was so weird is that everybody in the town knew what was going on up there, and they all claimed not to know anything, and they didn't do one single solitary thing.
That's
Okay.
what my Uncle Richard said when he talked to the people around the town. They go, we didn't know what was going on. They were just holding people. Yeah, well, except they all went into town to work and they went back to the camp.
They knew.
So
They
they
knew.
definitely knew. So the next book is one which I would hope most of you are familiar with, From a Name to a Number by Walter Wiener. And the reason I included this book in this talk is because it is an individual, of course, who we had, a Holocaust survivor, who talked at that we hosted for a talk. His father was brutally murdered on September 11th, 1939, when the German invaded Poland. Alter was then a boy of 13. At age 15, he was deported to Belhammer, a forced labor camp for Jews in Germany. He survived 5 camps. Upon liberation by the Russian army on May 9, 1945, Alter weighed 80 pounds, as reflected on the book's cover. He is very, very thin. Alter Wiener is one of the few Holocaust survivors still living in Portland. Unfortunately, this is not the fact. His autobiography is a testimony to unfolding tragedy taking place in World War II. Its message illustrates what prejudice may lead to and how tolerance is imperative. This book is not just Wiener's life story, but it also reveals many responses to his story. The unfortunate part, he survived the Holocaust only to be struck and killed by a car in Oregon on December 12th, 2018, at the age of 92. And I'm sure everybody that was part of this group remembered that day, unfortunately. I do, because I used to go to the synagogue with him. So it was a sad day. Tevye the Dairyman. So I talked about 5 different ones. We're going to come back and we're going to address some of them. And we're going to end up with one further book. But Tevye the Dairyman was written by Solomon Rabinovich, better known under his pen name, Sholem Aleichem. His father was a rabbi. Sholem was born in 1859. He grew up near the Shtetl of Veronica, and this was in the where I was talking about under the former Russian Empire. His father, Menachem Rabinovich, was rich merchant at the time. However, he failed a business affair, plunged the family into poverty, and Solomon Rabinovich grew up in reduced circumstances. When he was 13 years old, the family moved back to Pereslav, where his mother, Haya Esther, died of cholera epidemic. After witnessing the pogroms that swept through southern Russian Empire, including Kiev, Sholem Aleichem left Kiev and immigrated to the United States, where he arrived in 1906. The pogroms, for your information, started in 1882, the same year my grandparents left. So if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, you will find that there is scant resemblance between Sholem Aleichem's novel and the charming musical based on it. Fiddler on the Roof is culled from 4 of the 8 Tevye episodes. In Fiddler, Tevye has only 3 daughters, whereas Tevye the Dairyman has 7 daughters. Tevye the Dairyman comprises 8 stories, with Tevye each time supposedly meeting Sholem Aleichem by chance and relating the latest tales of his trials and tribulations. They have been published in translation under the following titles: Tevye Strikes It Rich, also translated as Tevye Wins a Fortune or The Great Windfall. Tevye Blows a Small Fortune, also translated as The Roof Falls In or The Bubble Burst. Today's Children, also has been translated as A Modern Children. Hodel, Hava, Frenzy. Tevye Leaves the Land of Israel, also has been translated as Tevye Goes to Palestine or Tevye Goes to Eretz Israel. And Lech Lecho, translated as Get Thee Out. Now the thing is, when we watch Fiddler on the Roof, it's all about, oh, woe is me. But the reality of these 8 books that he wrote about, these books are all composed about problems that are appearing in the Jewish community of Russia. And Sholem Aleichem writes on them specifically. He talks about money, how it affects happiness. If you make a lot of money, you're happy. If you're really poor, you're unhappy. But does money really make you happy? And he talks about one of his daughters becoming very wealthy and then committing suicide. The money didn't make her happy. It has one of the stories specifically talks about raising children and girls and the issues that come along with it. He deals with interfaith marriage because one of his daughters, this was in the movie, marries a Russian. And the issues of how he relates to that. It talks about suicide. I mentioned it already. His daughter committed suicide, which is considered the unpardonable sin in Judaism, that you can do anything else against God, but if you commit suicide, you've taken that last step away. He deals with divorce because one of his daughters ends up getting divorced. It happens to be the same one that married the Russian. So he not only had an interfaith marriage, he had a divorce issue. Both are prohibited. He deals with death. They don't show it in the movie, but his wife dies in one of these stories. And it is through that story where he questions whether God even exists. Of course, in the movie, it always shows him quoting a sort of quote of the Talmud or the Torah, but it's always slightly off from what it should be, showing that he's an ignorant Jew. And that's one of the things that Tevye, Sholem Aleichem is talking about. It also talks, the book also talks about returning to Israel. What does it mean to return to Israel? And was it, and you got to think about this, he went to Israel and it's placed in the 18th, 19th century, right when it's still Palestine and there hasn't been a whole lot of Jews there, and about him going there and his struggles to go there. And it woven throughout this whole book is discussions on religion and God, and what place does God take in our lives. And that's what this book is really all about. It is really a comedy, for one. It's not designed to be written as something that's just going to weigh you down. It's written as a comedy, and a sort of a woe is me type comedy. But it is also interesting when you read it and parse chapter by chapter the exact issues he's dealing with, the struggles that are occurring in Judaism of the 19th and 20th century, and how do you deal with it? That's the questions he asks. It's a really good book. The book is hugely better than the movie, as is typical for most books, but it makes you think. And for most movies, who wants to think? You just want to lean back and be entertained. Night by Elie Wiesel. Night is another one that we had to read in our Holocaust class. Elie Wiesel was born September 30th, 1928, in a city in the Carpathian Mountains of northern Transylvania, now Romania, to Shlomo Wiesel, a shopkeeper, and his wife, Sarah. The family lived in a community of about 10 to 20,000, mostly Orthodox Jews. Northern Transylvania had been annexed to Hungary in 1940, and restrictions on Jews were already in place. But the period Wiesel discussed at the beginning of the book, 1941 to 43, was relatively common for the Jewish population. You got to remember, Hungary, unlike all other countries, protected their Jews from the Nazis. They were not allowing it. They didn't allow they would literally hide the Jews from the Nazis. Unfortunately, in 1943-4, Hitler was coming up. They wanted the final solution. They wanted all Jews wiped out. And then this is when this story talks about. That changed on midnight, Saturday, the 18th of March, 1944, with the invasion of Hungary by Nazi Germany and the arrival in Budapest of Adolf Eichmann, very well known SS overseer, to oversee the deportation of the country's Jews to Auschwitz. They wanted to send every single Jew in Hungary, and they did. They literally emptied Hungary of Jews. It has the lowest population of Jews after the war of any of the countries, even Poland, even Germany.
Why?
From April,
Why would they be so aggressive in Hungary?
Because Hitler was angry with Hungary for trying to hide and protect the Jews before that.
Direct result.
Before that, he had said, you know, they had agreement with Germany, but they weren't part of Nazi Germany. Well, Hitler decided to take over Hungary, and then he says, well, since you've been protecting them, I'm going to eliminate every Jew in Hungary. And unfortunately, he was extremely successful. From April 5th, Jews over the age of 6 had to wear a 10 by 10 centimeter yellow badge on the upper left side of their coats or jackets, the Star of David, if you remember. Jews had to declare the value of their property and were forbidden from moving home, traveling, owning cars or radios, listening to foreign radio stations, or using the telephone. Jewish authors could no longer be published. Their books were removed from the libraries, and Jewish civil servants, journalists, and lawyers were all sacked.
David, did you know that star, that yellow star, comes from that Muslims used it first with Jews?
Yes, I was aware of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, under the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
As the Allies prepared for the liberation of Europe, the mass deportations began at a rate of 4 trains a day from Hungary to Auschwitz, carrying around 3,000 people. Between May 15th to July 8th, 437,402 Hungarian Jews are recorded as having been sent there on 147 trains, most gassed upon arrival. The transport comprised most of the Jewish population outside of Budapest, the Hungarian capital. Between May 16th and the 27th of June, 131,641 Jews were deported from northern Transylvania. Wiesel, his parents, his sisters, older sisters Hilda and Beatrice, and 7-year-old Zipporah were among them. Upon arrival, Jews were selected for the death or forced labor. To be sent to the left meant work. To be sent to the right, the gas chamber. Sarah and Zipporah were sent to the gas chamber. Hilda and Bernice survived, separated from the rest of the family. Sarah was the mother. Zipporah was the youngest child. The other 2 girls were young girls, so you can imagine what their fate was. Wiesel and Helmo, his dad, managed to stay together, surviving forced labor and a death march to another concentration camp, Buchenwald, near Weimar. Shlomo died there January 1945, 3 months before the 6th Armored Division of the United States arrived to liberate the camp. This was the one my uncle was involved in. And he had pictures. I have them in my possession today. Men and women were separated upon arrival at Auschwitz to Birkenau, the extermination camp within the Auschwitz complex. Eliezer and his father are selected to go to the left, which means they were forced labor. His mother, Hilda, Beatrice, and Zipporah to the right, the gas chamber. Hilda and Beatrice managed to survive, as again, they managed to survive because they were very attractive young women. 8 words spoken quite indifferently, quietly, indifferently, without emotion. Men to the left, women to the right. 8 short, simple words. For a part of a second, this is a quote from the book, I glimpsed my mother and my sisters moving away to the right. Zipporah held my mother's hand. Then I saw them disappear in the distance. My mother was stroking my sister's fair hair. And I did not know in that place, at that moment, I was parting from my mother and Zipporah forever. The remainder of night describes Eliezer's efforts not to be parted from his father, not to even lose sight of him. His grief and shame at witnessing his father's decline into helplessness, and as their relationship changes, the young man becomes the older man's caregiver. His resentment and guilt because of his father's existence threatens his own. The stronger Eliezer needs to survive, the weaker the bonds that tie them to each other. His loss of faith and in human relationship is mirrored in his loss of faith to God. He watched his father get beaten to death by the Nazis in the bunk below his, so it definitely affected him. During the first night, as he and his father wait in line, he watched the lorry deliver the loaded children's bodies into the fire. While his father recites the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, Wiesel writes that in the long history of the Jews, he does not know whether people have ever recited the prayer for the dead for themselves. Eliezer considers throwing himself against the electric fence. At that moment, he and his father are ordered to go into the barracks. So this story night is really is about losing faith. And he completely rejects God from having a very religious, Orthodox Jewish belief, thought. It is completely a true story. When you reach dawn and day, dawn is when he realizes there may be something more, and day is when he fully re-embraces his Orthodox belief. I wanted to finish tonight with one other book that's really important, and it raises important questions. This is just a piece out of it. A young Jew is taken from a death camp to a makeshift army hospital. He is led to the bedside of a Nazi soldier whose head is completely swathed in bandages. The dying Nazi blindly extends his hand towards the Jew, and a cracked whisper begins to speak. The Jew listens while the Nazi confesses to having participated in burning alive an entire village of Jews. Having listened to the Nazi story for several hours, torn between horror and compassion for the dying man, the Jew finally walks out of the room without speaking. What I didn't include in here, the Nazi asked for forgiveness for what he had done. And the question that it says, that it leaves you, when you read this book, you're left with two questions. Was he right to just walk out without ever talking to the Nazi, without ever accepting his forgiveness, without ever touching this individual? And this individual is dying. And was it moral? That when you read this book, The Sunflower, by Simon Wiesenthal, and those of you who don't know him, he was known as the Nazi hunter. He hunted Nazis all over the world after he survived the Nazi persecution. He's very well known for that. And this is the book. How do you deal with forgiveness, right? And that's what this book is all about. How do you, when asked to listen to a confession of someone who is asking your forgiveness, do you accept that confession, or do you, as this Jewish young man did, get up and walk away without saying a word to the person as he's dying on the bed? And that's really what we need to think about when we approach someone who has been, whose family has these memories down through the years. The Pope, if you were not aware, just put out a letter this week strongly condemning the actions of against the Jews, and that how we have to have forgiveness for them, and because of the actions of people in persecuting the Jews worldwide, we have neo-Nazi in this country like it has never been, right? The rise of the alt-right that believe that Jews have no place in this country, that they control the money, they control the news, they control, what you see on TV. that they're in control of the government and they need to be eliminated. It's straight out of that playbook. So I hope that each one of you takes time to read some of these books, because the books really do bring out nuances of Jewish life and how the treatment of them has affected how they look at people. Jews today are all over the world are scared. Neve Shalom, where I attend, as you know, has always had a police presence. Well, yeah, even 10 years ago on Shabbat, there would be a police officer. But now it's 24/7 security. Beth Israel has 24/7 security with law enforcement on every Sabbath from sunup to sundown, every Sabbath. Not only having standing security, armed security, they have law enforcement as well to help keep them safe. Almost every synagogue in the world is seeing that happen. And what's going on in Europe is frightening for Jews. And so I think that type of thing is going to happen around the world, and people who believe that people who have a certain religious belief will never experience that kind of hate and anger directed at them are really misleading themselves. It's going to happen. If it can happen to them, it can happen to us, right? Definitely. So I hope this helps a little bit. I hope it gives you some ideas. If you want to read night, it's short. It's 100 pages. Very easy read. It will disturb you because it talks about them being on the freight cars going from Hungary all the way to Germany. Think about that. They were packed in there, 3,000 people in 20 cars. So they're standing room only for 4 days. Think about the stuff you don't want to think about. The fact that where do you go to the bathroom? There's no bathrooms there, right? Think about this stuff. It burned itself into the psyche of the Jewish mind. It's a very good book.
It is a very good read. I had to read that in college, and it really, I think it probably put me on the path to where I am today.
Oh, it's impactful. Yeah, you want to read Sunflower, read Sunflower. It's the same way, except worse. It sears you bad. I gave up drinking before a long time ago during the Holocaust class. I seriously considered drinking again because I was having nightmares every night because we'd watch videos, we'd talk to people who had been there. We read these books, and we not only read them, we had to critically analyze it. And let me tell you, nothing will work on your brain when you critically analyze somebody's statement of what's happening to them. Well, let's close with prayer, shall we? Our dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for allowing us to talk about these subjects. Help us to learn how to interact with those who have had suffered under evil hands, Lord, and give us wisdom and caring, because we know those times are coming for us too. And so I ask you to hold each of us in your hands, that we may truly draw closer to you. And I thank you in the name of your Son, Yeshua. Amen.